Hi there. I'm Martin Pusic. I have the honor of being the education scholar at the Brigham Educational Institute, and today we're completing our series of four podcasts on the Master Adaptive Learner. Today we're going to tackle a thorny but I'm going to claim useful aspect of using metacognition, and that is using well-known educational theories to inform the way we teach. And so that I'm going to lay out again what our ambition is with the Master Adaptive Learner framework. But the emphasis here is going to be on getting us to think about how we think and how we can use solid theories to inform that. This work was funded by the American Medical Association as part of the Accelerating Change in Education initiative, and as such is the work of more than 30 medical schools, and it culminated in this Master Adaptive Learner handbook that we have available at the Brigham Educational Institute if you want to come see it. And so to repeat, what we've set up in this framework is basically an approach to education that claims that, starting from the bottom, that learning is a core part of being a clinician. And as a clinician, we, for each situation we find ourselves in, have to decide whether there's an emphasis on routine, well-oiled, efficient processes against innovating in the moment, which tends to be less efficient. And finally, the core of today's thing is the mastery of the theories and methods of learning, and that's what we're going to emphasize today. And we've reviewed this overall schematic of the Master Adaptive Learner with the four gears that start with planning, move to learning, assessing our learning, and finally adjusting our microsystem. And we've gone through those in the prior three podcasts. And all of these are mediated by good things like curiosity, motivation, mindset, and resilience. And a coaching approach is appropriate to this kind of learning. And if you'll remember, what we're saying is it's good to be an automatic expert, somebody who's really, really honed and routinized in their approach, but it's also good to be an adaptive expert, someone who can innovate in the moment and someone who can riff off of the affordances of the situation that they find themselves in. And so we want to train for adaptive expertise, the ability to get better and better. And what we want is for our clinicians to have a slope in which they're getting better and better as they move forward. And that means being open to innovation and not just routinized approaches. And so again, here's the definitions for the Master Adaptive Learner, and that we're going to focus today on the theories that underpin Master Adaptive Learning. We've called the Master Adaptive Learner framework a framework for a reason. We feel that it's like a coat hanger, and you can put in it all of the solid things that we know about education. And those solid things that we know about education are theories. And the framework is meant to evolve. It's not a static thing that you learn now and hold as unchangeable moving into the future. That would actually be contra the message of adaptive expertise. Instead, the idea is that it's a loose framework that can change as we learn more and more in our scientific investigations of education and of learning. And so that what's inside the Master Adaptive Learner framework should be different in 10 years' time compared to what it is today. And so we've, in the prior podcast, gone through some of the things that hang on this coat rack. In the first one, we talked about adaptive expertise and the need to situate people learning in the optimal adaptability corridor, where they have to rub against each other the imperative to be efficient versus the imperative to be innovative and creative. We looked at the Dunning-Kruger effect and talked about how understanding learning, and especially understanding how self-assessment can lead us wrong when we're just starting off in our learning journey, and working that into our systems so that we don't get deceived by these known cognitive biases. And this too is a theory or a metacognitive approach that we can put on our coat rack. And then in the last podcast, we talked about organizational level learning. And so that the Rogers innovation curve is a well-known concept, and with its idea of bleeding edge innovators and those who prefer to be conservative about whether to change and adopt new methods of being. And so this is a favorite quote: "There is nothing so practical as a good theory," and it was by Kurt Lewin in the 1940s. And at that point, there was a debate that continues to this day between different approaches to science. Should science be an applied thing that is useful today? Or should science be an airy-fairy thing in the clouds in which basic precepts are investigated without a clear path to their practicality? And so in the 1940s, that was a sizable debate, and you could dismiss someone as being a theoretician, and that theory is up in the clouds and not relevant to our real world. I, like Dr. Lewin and others, will make the claim that theories can be useful to you. And in this, I'm going to, each time I use the word theory, it's going to be in the sense of the scientific theory, something that's really, really well established, as opposed to the everyday way we think of theories, which is more like a hypothesis. In theory, this might work. Well, in hypothesis, this might work, because there's more everyday way of using that word. Here's a grid, and again, a grid that points to some of the trade-offs and theories, and our evidence for why we do things the way we do things can be laid out on this grid. And we can go on the horizontal axis from not having very much empirical evidence to having tons of empirical evidence as to why the world works the way it does. And then, and crucial to the idea of a scientific theory is on the vertical axis, we can go from low explanatory power to high explanatory power. And we'll come back to this grid in a bit, but what I'm going to say is that in the top right is where scientific theories sit. They have lots of empirical evidence for them, and they explain our world in a way that allows us to understand it better. So here's an exercise for you, and what we do when we're live is that I have people draw the line that best represents these data points. And so to situate you on the x-axis here, this is a learning curve. So that people have practiced reading x-rays, and their first x-ray is at the left of the x-axis, all the way to 250 x-rays on the at the end of the x-axis. And so with each repetition, they get feedback, and so they learn. And on the y-axis is how good they are. And so so for each point, this is an estimate of how well they scored on an exam of about 20 or 25 x-rays. And these are the points, and my question to you will be, which one of these two drawings of, or rather interpretations with regression lines, is the correct one? Is it the one on the left with the perfectly straight line, where y equals mx plus b, and there's an r squared for the regression, its explanatory power of 0.33? Or is it the one on the right with its curve going through the points and with its own exponential or power law formula and the same kind of explanatory power? I'll give you a second to choose, and you have to choose. Well, my claim is it's the one on the right. And the reason is sort of from approaching this as a statistician, you could say that both of the models are equally explanatory. Both of them divide the points in an algorithmic kind of way that explains the variance in the y-axis to the same amount, as evidenced by that r-squared value. But if you look at the straight line, what that means is that with each and every X-ray I do, I get better, and eventually I am going to score higher than 100%. Whereas we know that learning follows an asymptotic learning curve, and so that we can approach 100%, be really, really good at the thing, but we can never exceed that. And we have good scientific theories that explain. And so our theory, our learning curve theory, which is years, is that learning is not linear. And so learning has a phase in it that seems linear, but the shoulders at the start and at the end are not linear and instead are curved. And this has to do with, at the left-hand side, the fact that we have to organize ourselves as we learn, and as we don't get very much better as we orient to the learning and try and lay down the basic principles, like learning the vocabulary in a language. And then at the end, sort of when you're at the highest end of the expertise, you're learning the hardest thing there is to learn. So that's where we start swimming in our ignorance, and we're not very, very efficient at that part of it. And so the gains that we make in learning at the high end of extreme right of a learning curve are slower, as evidenced by the shape of the curve here. And so in terms of our grid, what we've done is laid out different ways of thinking of the evidence that we have for understanding the world. And so that on the top right, and I foreshadowed that we would situate a scientific theory up in the top right, where there's high explanatory power and high empirical evidence. And for learning curves, we know from doing all sorts of experiments on rats, on pigeons, on people, on organizations, in cigar factories, in learning radiology, in rats doing mazes, and hundreds and thousands of experiments, that over and over again, the way it looks like is that S-shaped curve that I showed you. But what makes it a theory is that we understand why it's S-shaped. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but it's that idea that that as you go further to the right, as you go up the expertise side of things get harder to learn, and all the low-hanging fruit has been picked, and so that the harder things to learn are what remains, and therefore learning is less efficient. And so that when you investigate it at a microscopic level or at a granular level, that's what you see happening. So that, and hence the logistic shape. There are lots of things in science where we have a ton of empirical evidence for why it works, or how it works, and so that irregularities. So a scientific law, like the law of gravity, is something that always happens in exactly the same way, but you and I don't understand it. And so not even you and I, the world doesn't understand it. We know it happens that way, but exactly what's happening with gravity and why those things pull in the way that they do, we do not understand. And so we'll call that a scientific law to distinguish it from when we do understand what's happening with a scientific theory. In the middle of all this, I've laid out models, and models are, kind of candidate understandings of the world, and they can float from being very, very crude and guesses and hypotheses and the whole bit through to scientific theories and models. And so that these models will allow us to create something, and then we go out and collect evidence and see how it plays out. So that space is where scientific investigation happens, and then back at the area where we have low empirical evidence is the idea of the hypothesis. That's where we start. And a hypothesis can have high explanatory power, and so in the top left you can have fun thinking about what would have high explanatory power with low empirical evidence. But something like magic, in most magician-like fashion, might be something that you would situate up there. You can explain what happens, but your explanation has relatively low empirical evidence. And so we've got a paper that goes into this in some detail. So feel free to reference that. And in that paper, we go through some of the features of scientific theories. And this has been evolved through the philosophy of science movement. And I won't go through each of these things, but a good scientific theory has properties that tell us it's a good scientific theory. It's scalable and generalizable. It allows us to predict with certainty what's going to happen. I talked about the high explanatory power of scientific theories, and they have a certain parsimony, a certain ability to simplify or reduce to the core our understanding of a particular phenomenon. And so a good scientific theory is elegant, and perhaps the poster child being Einstein's E equals mc squared. In 4 symbols, he summarizes what would have been a very, very, very complex area. So back to our coat rack idea, if we've got scientific theories like the learning curve theory, then we can go out into the world and see the world informed by our understandings of these sorts of phenomena. And it's like a kind of touchstone. Here's what I'm sure of. So as I go out into an uncertain world, and a clinician certainly goes out into an uncertain world, I can lean on these things that I know to be true. And so here is the idea of metacognition, and that one of the core ideas of education is to allow somebody to see the world well. And so my example here is, many of you will have seen this classic drawing from the psychology literature, in which we show a black and white drawing of, is it an old woman or is it a young woman? So that the old woman has her, I can't point to it here, but just trust me that both are in there. The young woman is looking away, and you can see her eyelash. The old woman is looking 3/4 towards you, and you can see her eye there. And so that recently I saw a New Yorker cartoon where they embellished this and did a play on words in terms of the duality of the figure. But my point is that if I tell you it's an old woman, you see the old woman and you hunt for the clues, and you are awake to the possibility that it's an old woman, and you find the evidence there. If I tell you that it's a young woman, then you'll do the opposite. And if I tell you it's both, then you'll find both. But the core thing in terms of teaching, and the core thing in terms of having people go out into the world with scientific theories as tools, is to lay them out in a way that allows them to see the world in a more enlightened fashion. And so a great example of that is when we teach differential diagnoses in the health professions. And so that we could teach them as a flat list. The differential diagnosis of low urine output is these 17 things. And yet if we split it up and we tell you that there's a theory that some things are pre-renal, some things are renal, and some things are post-renal, that allows you to not only break up the 17-item list into more manageable chunks, but it also explains something of how low urine output happens. And so that you can imagine the pre-renal things being hypovolemia and the like, so that happening this well before the kidney, and the kidney responds normally, all the way through to obstructions in the urethra that cause urinary retention and low urine output because of mechanical reasons. And so in elaborating the theory, we've not only sort of described the regularities in the world, but helped explain in a way that allows the person to retain the story better. And so the MAL framework tries to do that for health professions education. And so the MAL framework is an advanced organizer or script for how we want our learners to be, our learners to see in the future. And this is that ambition that we have of teaching our health professions learners today in a way that will still be advantageous for them in 10 years' time or more. So that so I'd shown this in one of the prior podcasts, and again in the blue shading there on the x-axis is the idea of how we teach today. And if we teach today with a metacognitive approach in which we give people these advanced organizers, we give people these theories, then no matter what happens in the retention interval, they will be better at learning on into the future, because they see the world in a fashion that is meant to advantage their learning. So in that article that, or one of the articles that we've supplied for this session, we list a whole bunch of learning theories. We list a whole bunch of things that would be advantageous for you to have a passing, you, the health professions educator, to have a passing knowledge of as elements on that coat rack that is the Master Adaptive Learner Framework. And so that so each of these theories, and I encourage you to flip through and think about and rub one against the other these ideas for how learning works. Because what we want is, in our master adaptive learners, in our medical students, in our nursing students, in our about to retire surgeons, the whole spectrum, are people who know how to learn. And they know the scientific underpinnings of how to learn, and they know the regularities of how learning works in the world. So I showed you some overall theories. There are theories around planning, and so that's where that Dunning-Kruger conceptualization comes in, and as well as ideas of informed self-assessment. We have ideas around learning, and so that the desirable difficulties framework by Bjork and Bjork, about the fourth one down there, is the one that we discussed in one of the sessions. But there's all these other ideas around learning and how we situate learning that are very, very helpful in terms of deciding how to make it more effective. Assessing is difficult, and again, the Dunning-Kruger conceptualization is listed there, as well as reflection by as espoused by Schoen, and deep introspective Jesuit-like reflection is a really, really great way of learning, and a great habit for learning. And then the adjusting phase, in which we would use adaptive expertise to influence our organizations and get our organizations to think, or there are systems to improve in terms of the learning of each of the individuals, and so that so ideas around systems thinking and the Rogers innovation curve is what fits in there. So you can take there are certainly more theories than we've listed here, but again, the overall approach. A theory is something that's regular in the world, that people have obsessed a lot about, and that has high empirical evidence, and that has high explanatory power. And so a good arrow in our quiver, and to know these theories and to be able to move forward in the world with them, advantages our learners and means they can learn how to learn in a way that will keep them going for a long time. In that graphic that you saw with the Master Adaptive Learner, we talked about batteries and the enabling things of curiosity, motivation, mindset, and resilience, and so that each of those have their own theoretical evidence for them. I encourage you to read on these as well. So to pause and digest that in terms of its implications for master adaptive learning, again, what we're saying here is that the clinician of the future is a learner. And the clinician of a future as a learner needs to have mastered the theories of learning. And it doesn't have to be mastery in the sense of a scientist, but as a practitioner of learning, we need to teach them how to learn based on solid scientific theory, and putting those in front of the learner early on in their development will create that positive compounding learning that we're after. And so I showed you the adaptive expertise conceptualization. And so by showing people that our aim is to have them aiming for adaptive expertise right out of the gate, and knowing how to balance routine or efficient approaches with innovative ones. We want to have them be good self-assessors. We want them to be feedback-seeking machines, and by explaining why that is and when they can rely on their self-assessment and when they can't, that they can negotiate all of the feedback that's going to be out there to their advantage in terms of becoming better clinicians. We want them to be good citizens within an organization, and so some of us need to be bleeding edge innovators. Some of us have to approach it with a more critical eye and to demand the evidence and to say, why do we have to change? We need both. So the Rogers curve in terms of technology adoption is sometimes used to hammer the laggards, whereas in fact we need to acknowledge that the world works this way for a good reason and to plan for it in our organizational change models. And then my favorite, learning curve theory, we need to take into account that learning is not linear. And so that the highest levels of expertise require really, really effortful learning. And we need to situate ourselves in that way and anticipate that learning gets hard and support learning even when it does get hard at the far right of the learning curve. And so all of those things add up to arrows in the quiver of the master adaptive learner, and ways of approaching the world in order to learn ever better on into the future, as mentioned. And so that's what I have for you. Over these 4 sessions, we started with a claim that we needed a metacognitive approach to clinician learning, and that initial session was centered on adaptive expertise, and that's what our clinicians of the future are going to need in order to, in fact, clinically survive. We then, in the second session, talked about planning and learning phases and the way you set up learning, and emphasized surprising principles behind the best learning, so that it can be difficult and should be difficult, and we should organize ourselves in that way. In the third session, we talked about assessing and adjusting, and so that the difficulties of assessment, and pointed them out so that the learners can take them into account as they judge their learning moving into the world, and also, as I just mentioned, encourage them to use their learning to influence the systems that they're parts of. And then finally, today we've talked about educational theory, educational science theory, and made an argument for including or learning those scientific theories so they can move forth into the world knowing which parts we're sure of and which parts we're not, so that the learning can continue in the best way possible. So thank you very much for hanging in there, and best wishes.